Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamerTech.com video, we're going to be talking more about the PlayStation 4 and specifically how it was designed, the thoughts behind it, as well as the developer's reaction, Sony's reaction, and the reaction to the gaming industry as a whole. So, as you guys may know, the PlayStation 3 was met with a fairly lukewarm reception in terms of the hardware, specifically from developers. Gabe Newell, of course, from Valve Hall of Fame, went on record and said that he thought the system should be scrapped, and there were a couple of other people who shared his similar thoughts, really. Now, the lead architect of the PlayStation 4, who is Mark Cerny, said he knew back in 2007, and this is a direct quote, that clearly we had some issues with the PlayStation 3. In regards to those issues, it was mostly the complexity specifically derived from the cellular processor, as well as the memory. The memory was a really big issue, specifically bandwidth, but also, of course, the sheer amount of it just wasn't that much. So what would basically happen is, let's say you're a PC developer, I think that's a good one, then you can probably get used to the Xbox 360. It has, of course, DX support, although obviously not as high a version as, say, modern PC titles. And sure, you have limited memory on that as well. It is only 512, just like the PlayStation 3's total. But the difference was the processor was a little bit easier to work with, and the graphics card itself was also easier to work with too, and the libraries that were available for the PlayStation were certainly a lot harder to develop for. And Mark went on to say that the biggest thing, we didn't want the hardware to be a puzzle that programmers would need to solve to make quality titles. And this, of course, was referencing the cell processor that was, of course, at the heart of the PlayStation 3. Now, that's not to say that the PlayStation 3 was an abomination, and that's not to say that the cell processor inside the PlayStation 3 was bad. It was actually a fairly decent processor, it's just not very easy to work with. So, Mark actually won the lead, shall we say, for the design. In other words, he kind of pitched the idea of an x86-based architecture, and his reasoning behind that was fairly solid. And that is that there are a lot of PC developers out there, and they were all complaining, with legitimate cause, might I add, that, you know, they're not just saying it for the purpose of saying it. There's a couple of reasons I mention this real quick. First of all, if you're developing for a system that's harder to program for, it may mean that your game cannot be ported easily. I've used the example of, say, the Sega Saturn before, and one of those was, back in the days of the Sega Saturn, the actual system was extremely powerful. It had a dual CPU design, believe it or not, even back then. And it had a lot of video power as well. It just didn't work too well with 3D unless you really, well, kind of got down into the machine code. This is also to do with the way the two CPUs interacted with the memory. And a little known group, you may have heard of them, but they're probably not, because they've been defunct for a while now, and that would be Lobotomy Software. And Lobotomy Software actually went broke because they were put in charge of porting a couple of games, you may have heard of those, Duke Nukem 3D and Quake, to the Sega Saturn. As it turns out, they did a fantastic job. They actually used the Slave Driver engine as a base for that, and the Slave Driver engine, as I've mentioned in another video, was the base of Exhumed, which I believe in the United States it was called Power Slave, but don't quote me on that. Regardless, it was such a monumental task for them to port it that even though this game sold reasonable, I mean, it didn't sell amazingly because of the install base on the Sega Saturn, but they just couldn't get the numbers because of how costly it was. It was almost like, rather than porting the game, that you basically rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. So one of the problems, of course, is that development studios often couldn't do that. Often they would have to say, hey, you know what, we can't afford to do this, we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, we don't have the capital to do this for the PlayStation. Therefore, quite often, the PlayStation titles would suffer. And that's not to say that they were really bad, it's just to say that they weren't as good usually is the Xbox versions. See, for example, Call of Duty, which runs at a slightly lower resolution, and Call of Duty is by no means the only example here. There are others. Xbox also does MSAA, so in other words a form of anti-aliasing to remove those jaggies quite a bit better as well. That's mostly thanks to the small amount of frame buffer, very fast ED RAM. So how did Mark, after he landed the project, understood the previous issues, at least most of them from the developers? How did he go forward? Well, there were a number of hurdles in his way. First of all, you can't just go about and say, hey, how can we design a PlayStation 4? You can't say that to developers for obvious reasons of leaks and so on. And obviously the technology, or should I say the specs, leaked anyway, but it certainly took a lot longer. So how you would have to do it would be something like, I don't know, a questionnaire. Indeed, that's exactly what he did. He basically created a questionnaire, and in that questionnaire he would ask developers of game developers as well as engine makers what they thought the next generation of systems may bring. In other words, when you ask a question like that, invariably most people are going to be kind of edging towards what they would like. And unified memory was pretty much on top of the list, and no more than 8 processing cores was another one. Bandwidth is always a massive consideration of games developers, as well as, of course, the amount of memory. Let's talk about the amount of memory just for a second, or memory as a whole. Now, obviously, the system does have 176 gigabytes of GDDR5, and as you guys probably are aware by now, that's usually reserved for graphics cards. Now, 176 gigabytes per second isn't exactly unheard of. As I've said before, for consoles, it's certainly high. For PC graphics cards, however, it's kind of middling. It's around the middle kind of range that a lot of them are hitting now. But it's worth noting that this memory is split up in terms of bandwidth to be a lot less in certain areas. From what we understand, it does seem that a few developers have said that the CPU is hitting around 20 gigabytes per second, which is still pretty darn good, and it's around a third less bandwidth than, say, Ivy Bridge from Intel hits. So that's still pretty nice. However, regardless, for a console and a closed source, very closed system, it's absolutely insane. And I'll give you a couple of tweets and comments from John Carmack, for example. John Carmack said, "I can't speak freely about the PlayStation 4, but now there have been some specs have been made public. I can say that Sony have made some wise engineering choices." Now, John Carmack, of course, is pretty much a legend, not only in PC gaming, but gaming as a whole. He has made a ridiculous amount of incredible games in terms of their influence on the industry. Its Software, of course, Hall of Fame. Another one from Sousa, I believe that's how you pronounce his name anyway, I'm possibly wrong, but 8 gigabytes of unified mem is baseline for next tech iterations, makes me very, very happy. Fun times coming, and with a smiley face as well. That was from a tweet, by the way. The message here that Sony are trying to put across, indeed, another point as well that I'll get into more in depth in a moment is the development tools that Sony are providing for developers, but we'll get into that more in a moment. But the message here is very clear, very simple. Sony want the PlayStation 4 and developers to be friends. They want them to marry, and they want them to have children together, which would be, of course, games that you will buy. Sony alienated, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm not saying that, Sony annoyed or, were on bad terms with developers. I don't mean like that, but I mean alienated in terms of they knew the games would sell well on the hardware, but at the same time they were like, oh god, I have to work on the cell processor, and I'm used to working on Xbox, and I'm used to working on, PCs, and I have no idea what I'm doing. That's pretty much what it was coming down to. And bear in mind that PCs have their own inherent problems as well, mostly regarding the architecture is not closed. In other words, as I've said before in numerous videos, drivers, hardware Windows operating system versions, they all play a role in the performance of the machine. I'll give you a very simple example that I think is absolutely fantastic. Drivers alone can make an absolute massive difference, and I'm probably going to do a separate video on this, actually discussing my thoughts on graphics cards and so on, because I get in a lot of questions regarding, hey, I've got a PC, what graphics card should I buy, and so on. But drivers alone make an absolute massive difference in performance. Tomb Raider, for example, on the Nvidia, when I first loaded that thing, I was like, what the hell's going on with my frame rates, particularly when Tras FX was enabled. And although it looked amazing, it really battered Nvidia cards. It pretty much bitch slapped them until they cried. And it was mostly to do with the fact it was an AMD optimized game. I'm not, don't have anything against the developers, it's just a fact. And Nvidia's drivers really didn't like it. Anyway, fast forward a couple of weeks, and now we have a recent driver release, which has massively improved. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's around 70, 71%, something like that. And Bioshock Infinite, same thing. I don't remember what the number is on that. I think it's around 30 to 40% improvement, although that does depend on the rest of your machine, as well as, of course, the graphics hardware in it. And one of the problems of the last generation of consoles was just simply memory. I've mentioned before in regards to Dishonored, the developers went on record and have said that one of the primary issues they had wasn't even the processor. It was simply memory. They just didn't have enough, and quite a lot of it was actually cut out. And bear in mind that those guys were PC developers from the beginning, and they love PC games, but you have to make games on consoles now. It's a simple case of financial success. And bear in mind also, I don't know why I keep using that phrase, regardless, these guys are also going to be very happy because obviously we've got the new Thief announced as well. The processors weren't bad, but memory for the games on their systems anyway were problems. Other developers who specialised in Sony hardware, Naughty Dog are a prime example of that. They, of course, released Uncharted, and I've mentioned before that Uncharted was very impressive. Uncharted 3 looked beautiful. There's no disputing that. Sure, it had some, jaggers here and there, but overall the game looked very impressive. But those guys were experts on the machine at this point. They weren't cross-developing. They weren't developing for PC, Wii, and Xbox, and every other console under the sun. Despite the fact that the architecture is a lot easier, you have had people go on record before, developers go on record and say that sure, the system is not going to be able to compete with modern day PCs. Nvidia have been obviously willing to say that. There is some thoughts in the industry that Nvidia are a little bit bitter. Maybe they did actually go in and put in some bids for the PlayStation. Maybe Sony could come up with it. Maybe they just said, hey, you know what, AMD have just got a better offering because obviously they bought out ATI, and you've got the the GCN cores in there, which are fantastic, of course, because of compute tasks. Not that Nvidia can't do compute tasks, it's just that it's a fact that the 7000 series is better for compute tasks, which is a bit of a shame actually, because I'm actually going to have to go with Nvidia because of their support for Adobe Premiere, but that's just me bitching about something completely irrelevant. And obviously games developers have said the same thing. But honestly, from the perspective of console development, this isn't a problem. I don't think anyone really cares if games don't look quite as good on console as PC. Maybe they do. Maybe, there are a few people that really care. And obviously I do graphics comparisons before anyone does comments on that. But I honestly like consoles for completely different reasons for PC, but I must say that because of the closed nature of the system, even if the games can't look quite as good, I will admit that the games do look very impressive at the moment, and Killzone, for example, is a great example of that. There are obvious other benefits with working with Sony, and they do seem to be very, very keen to give developers support in terms of the tools. Now, I mentioned just yesterday's video, I think it was, a bit on the GDC conference, that developers have quite a few options when developing for the system, including a lower level kind of functionality and a higher level functionality. Basically, if they want to get down to almost hardware level, they can. On the other hand, if they want to almost have a wrapper to kind of deal with most of the stuff, then they also can do that too. The great benefit, of course, for all of this is that they can actually tweak things as necessary. They can tweak the wrapper as necessary. So if they don't, if for example they say, hey, this doesn't really play well with our physics, or doesn't really play well with our graphics, or we need to rewrite this part, we can rewrite a third of it, we can just use it as is, we can rewrite the whole thing. It's completely up to them, and that's fantastic to hit the ground running with a project. It gives you a framework, and I'll give you a really simple but not a particularly accurate example of that. Have you ever opened up Microsoft Word or whatever in a text editing program because you've got an essay or a project or whatever you need to do, and you're just staring at that blank document and you're thinking, okay, chapter 1, and you're just kind of staring at the rest of the screen blankly for a couple of minutes. Well, the idea behind that is, of course, similar principle. If you're not really, if you've got nothing to start with, it's very difficult. Sony are giving them, I wouldn't exactly use the word templates because they're not technically templates in a traditional sense, but at least it gives them a starting point, and this gives them almost like a framework to quickly hang something up. And I'll give you another quote. This time from the Witcher 3 developer, which would be, of course, CD Projekt Red. They were mentioning, because of the PC architecture, or the PC-like architecture, you can just make one change during development, and that effect will affect all versions of the game, rather than a bespoke changes for each. And continuing this time around, the situation is much easier for developers. He's the head of CD Projekt Red, and much easier means much quicker, which means saving time, which means saving money, less faff, more creativity, better results. And this is what I've been saying for quite a while now. The industry for games specifically are becoming a lot more convoluted. I've not actually completed Bioshock yet. I stayed up really late and I still haven't completed it. I haven't actually gotten past the kind of initial video that I did, but I'm going to try to smack some out for you guys today. But Tomb Raider and Bioshock were in development for quite a while. Specifically Bioshock, I'll mention in this video. A couple of people who I do know who have completed it, including Spoonie Kipper on this channel, said the game's roughly 10 hours, which goes in conjunction with a lot of the reviews I've been reading. Obviously your mileage may vary depending on if you're one of those people who want to listen to every single conversation, every single cutscene, look at every single nook and cranny. It might last you an hour or two longer. If you're someone who just wants to blast through the game as quickly as possible, maybe a little bit shorter. But let's go with a median of 10 hours. Why? Why does it take 10 hours? I mean, the game's been in development for what? However long, I can't even think of the time period right now, but it's been in development for a while. It's not like it's been in there for like a year, like say Call of Duty or something like that. How come? The answer is very simple. It's AI, it's art direction, it's programming on all these different systems, it's bug fixing, it's the music, it's the scripting, it's the storyline. Look at something like World of Warcraft now. I know I use World of Warcraft quite often, but hear me out for a second. When you take a game like World of Warcraft, the original World of Warcraft, the core game, before the Burning Crusade, before Wrath of the Lich King, before all these expansions, the game was in development for a while and was in alpha and betas, and of course, some people could play those depending on, if you were lucky, blah blah blah. But the point is that it was in development for a hell of a long time, but once the base game was out, of course, they've made numerous changes for it. The point being, though, that the original game took ages. This is the same with many MMOs. And let's talk about Oblivion, or Skyrim. Very open source, very big, very sprawling. And there's a reason that quite a few areas have a heavy emphasis of the clone brush on them. Or even the upcoming Grand Theft Auto 5. Put it this way, let's assume for a moment that Microsoft had said, hey, you know what, we're going to go with Blu-ray or HD DVD. Let's assume that storage medium wasn't even a problem, just for a second. Right, let's live in a fantasy world for a moment, and let's take that supposition that storage space is not a problem. The point being that games still take a hell of a long time to develop. It's that simple. A game is not put out in a few minutes. Sure, if you're putting out a relatively simple game, it's not so much of a big deal. Especially as now you've got a lot of really awesome engines that are kind of ready-made, and you can, as I've said previously, throw a lot of the stuff on, but you still usually need to do some tweaking. But now as games are becoming a lot more convoluted, complex, and so on, there's a good reason that, say, PlayStation 1 games aren't that much longer, or shorter, should I say, than current games. Indeed, sometimes PlayStation 1 games are actually a lot longer because of the storage medium, the disc. They didn't really have to worry so much about texture. So, with the PlayStation, it was very difficult to program for, and indeed, the Xbox had some of the problems I've mentioned before about the RAM limitations on the Xbox 360, and certainly that's not the only issue on the 360. The disc lack of the built-in hard drive is standard. I'm not picking on the consoles, by the way. You know I don't like to do that. I'm just merely giving you examples. And because of this, it really slows down development time. And as Adam has said from, of course, CD Projekt Red, it increases the costs, it reduces creativity, because if you want to, for example, add in a monastery into the background of your game, I just use that just because I don't know why, but let's say you're travelling along a cliff face in the game and you see a monastery, and let's say that monastery, you know, is kind of on fire because it's been, you know, ransacked or whatever, and let's say that, you know, there are bats flying around and whatever else, and maybe you've got thunder flashing in the sky, and maybe it's raining a little bit, and maybe, you know, kind of to the right of you, you've got kind of another cliff face that's been, and maybe there's, like, you know, people fighting on there and all of that stuff. That might be the original artistic vision, okay? But the original artistic vision doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they can get hold of. Reality then sets in and say, hey, yeah, we can compress this to hell, but in reality, this is going to take, you know, grand total of, let's go with 582 megabytes. We need to squeeze this down, my friend. And the actual reality is we've got less than 512. Now, I know what you're going to say, but what about if the system does have 512? Well, first of all, the PlayStation 3's architecture split the memory in two. And it had graphics memory and main system memory, which is one of the reasons that a lot of these guys are going really kind of crazy on the unified aspect of this. But the other problem is system overheads. A console just doesn't run out of thin air. You do actually need some memory reserved for system functionality. So by the time you've got all that, let's say that system memory is, let's call it 32 megabytes of memory. Let's say you've got 480 left over. I can't remember the exact number is for the PlayStation 3. I think it's around 470, 480. The number slips out of my head quite often, but it's around there. It's not, you know, it's not like half the memory or something reserved. But let's say you do have that, even on a unified system like the Xbox 360. The point being that eventually reality sits in and says, hey, it doesn't matter, you know, what you do. We've got limitations here. And so that is a fantastic thing from the point of view of developers. They've got a lot of room to play with. And I think that's one of the really great things about Sony. They really did listen to developers. And kudos for them for doing it. Indeed, even functionality, as I mentioned yesterday with the Rumble feature on the PlayStation, I've never been a big fan of it. I've mentioned that from several videos before. I just personally don't really like vibration, but I know quite a lot of people do. One of the big concerns that I had, or not concerns, one of the primary issues with it is that there was usually no middle ground. The vibration was either on or off, and obviously with the PlayStation 3, for example, the controller had two motors in it. But they were binary in terms of it was either on or off. In other words, the big motor would be on, or the small motor would be on, or, you know, both would be off, or both could be on. I think both could be on anyway. But now that's not the case, and there's actually different levels that they can make these motors spin. And while that might sound like a very small thing that I'm mentioning this, I'm just merely pointing out that developers have that option to actually focus and adjust these motors, and I think that's really cool. Even indeed the light strip, the light bar, if you will, on the controller, they can actually make it so that that flashes. And I just think it's really cool that they're giving them these technologies. And indeed, for gamers, for us, for you and I, who are, you know, what actually going to play the games, and obviously developers are gamers as well at the end of the day, people love the idea of being able to download while you're playing. I've mentioned before in a previous video that one of the issues I had with the PlayStation is it was a great console, but it really interrupted you quite a bit, and I didn't like that. Specifically on downloading and installing updates on the PlayStation was a pain. There's a couple of times, well, numerous times, where I seen an update that needs to be downloaded for the game before I could play it online. I was just like, you know what, I don't have time for this. I just want to play a quick game on X, and I don't have the time to download the update, wait for the 15 hours for it to install the update, because invariably it's going to be slow, and that's it. And of course, the same problem with downloading demos and downloading full games releases. Another issue, of course, I have with the full game releases, by the by, was the price of them. Sony had a very nasty habit. I don't know what it's like in the United States or Australia or any other part of the world, but in the UK, for example, often we'd have to pay pretty much full price. Although PlayStation Plus was a quite good deal, but that's a different topic. I didn't really like the pricing scheme of buying games online with the PlayStation. They were significantly more expensive than the CD variant, or should I say the Blu-ray variant, and I really didn't like that as well, but that's a different topic. Hopefully they'll fix that as well. But the idea of being able to download games and play them as they're downloading is very nice. Obviously that's going to be not particularly new, it's not like it's innovative in terms of no one's ever done this before. Steam have, and it works. That's the thing. In the UK, we're having faster connections. I've mentioned a couple of times before that I'm on 120 megabytes per second. Most of my friends are on 60-ish. There's some that are still on 20s, but certainly if you could download like 4 gigabytes and then start playing, or 1 gigabyte, and that's enough to, start playing like a 10 or 20 hour game, that would be absolutely awesome. Downloading games, basically more seamless, integration with everything. Sony are really going for that, and to be fair as well to Valve and to Microsoft and various other developers on PC, they're starting to really go in for that as well. Indeed, there's actually a couple of really cool functionalities that I like about Steam right now. Although I haven't done a specific video for it, obviously you guys are aware of one of the big changes on Steam, and that would be, of course, the big picture, which is quite a nice touch, by the way. I do like that, although it doesn't really benefit me that much. But one of the really awesome things is that you can actually go ahead and say, you know what I want to do? I want to actually play pre-release games, and you can actually get betas, and if you play those betas, obviously then you can contribute to the games. And not all games not all the games are available for this, obviously, but I just like the fact that you can actually go ahead and do this. Hopefully that'll be something that, well, pretty much we, and by we I mean, gamers on PlayStation will be able to do too. Now, obviously, the PlayStation 4 is not a perfect console. There will invariably be some issues. It may be that the CPU isn't quite fast enough. It may be that it breaks. For all we know, there'll be an RROD issue with the PlayStation. It could be that the online services aren't as smooth. It could be something similar. Who knows? It could be that the console transforms into a robot at night and tries to kill you, and you have to fight it off every morning. But we just don't know. The system, however, does look very promising, and I think that's very good. Sony were definitely on the back foot the previous generation. Microsoft, of course, certainly didn't get us scotch-free. This generation is going to be very interesting indeed. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Microsoft's answer to a lot of this stuff is. I would like to be honest with you, to have seen a few more changes on the on the PlayStation 4. In terms of development, I would have liked to have seen slightly more powerful GCN, or 1 or 2 more cores on the GCN side of things, maybe 20, which would have put it more in line with the laptop amount. But considering that the system's going to be fairly cheap, and by fairly cheap I'm not saying 400 is free or anything like that, but I'm saying that it seems that it's fairly reasonably priced for what you're going to be getting. I think it's a pretty good deal. I think that Microsoft have going to be having a very interesting time. Although Microsoft are not stupid either, and I have a feeling that they too are going to be talking to developers. It's going to be interesting what their take is in regards to the memory. It seems from my initial bit of research, and by initial I use that word because, quite simply put, there isn't that much information in regards to the Xbox 720 yet. It's all hearsay. And it does seem, however, that there's going to be a lot of emphasis put on this small, fast amount of memory, and I'm not sure developers are going to like that. Obviously, we don't know if that's even the case. For all we know, they're going to be using faster amounts of memory, or maybe that buffer is a lot larger, or, we just don't know. But in regards to the PlayStation side of things, things are looking pretty rosy indeed. They seem to be covering pretty much all the bases, and I have a feeling that when the system's released, it's going to be very interesting for the first couple of months, and I would like to see fast forward into the year, maybe look into a crystal ball, if you will, say 4 years into the future, 3 years into the future, which is really when the consoles start to hit their stride. 1 year, developers are starting to kind of get used to things. 2 years, well, we understand some more techniques. 3 years, and you're pretty much comfortable. And the last couple of years of a console's life is basically you're on your knees praying to the console gods to try and spare any little bit of power you can to make your new titles look shiny. That's just kind of the bedding in period, if you will, of consoles. It's just how it works. Anyway, I think I've rabbited on enough on this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's not been too technical, but I just wanted to throw out some developers' opinions, some of my own and everything else, just because I think it's pretty cool to talk about the PlayStation 4. It's definitely one of my favourite topics right now. In terms of upcoming stuff on RGT, we're going to... Sorry, that was my finger that just cracked, in case you heard that. There's going to be a heavy amount of analyses and everything else, of course. I will be continuing some Let's Plays that I haven't been really focused on. I'm going to also try to talk some tech in them as well while I'm not getting murdered, because I think that would be kind of cool, but certainly nothing too in-depth, just for the fun of it, really. I'll be doing a blog at some point. Murasaki will be, and he's usually the guy that's providing the fighting game stuff. He'll be doing a lot of fighting game related streams and so on over the next couple of months. We're also looking to be doing some really cool things regarding screen overlays and so on in regards to news videos, but we've not had the time to do that right now. So hopefully over the next couple of weeks, we've been saying that for a while now, but we really do want to kind of push that. It's just time, unfortunately. There'll also be some other bits and pieces. You guys know that there's a competition right now. If you're into Final Fantasy, it's well worth checking out. You can actually win a physical item. It's pretty cool. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking about doing a second competition. That'll be for 2,000 subs, although maybe depending how quickly we get the 2k subs, it's actually possible that the two competitions would basically overlap, and so I'm thinking maybe of postponing and doing it for 2,500 or 3k subs. I haven't really decided yet, but that'll probably be a game or something. I haven't really decided. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out over the next couple of weeks and months. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will be seeing you soon. Take care and bye for now.